The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects as David Williams pressed his pen against the crumpled napkin, his hand moving faster than his thoughts could keep up. The numbers weren't lying. TechCore Industries was 13 minutes away from automatic security lockdown, and somewhere in the maze of code sprawled across his makeshift workspace, a $100 million solution was taking shape. "David, we gotta go, son." His father's voice carried across the empty boardroom, muffled by the industrial mop bucket he was wheeling toward the exit. Marcus Williams had been cleaning these offices for 15 years, long enough to know that security didn't care if you were the janitor's kid when those magnetic locks engage at midnight. But David couldn't move. Not when he'd just heard CEO Sarah Chen's panicked voice through the conference room speakers during her emergency call to the board 20 minutes ago. "The entire AI system is crashing under load. If we can't fix this by market open, we're looking at bankruptcy by Friday." The irony wasn't lost on him. While TechCore's army of PhD engineers had spent 3 months and burned through millions trying to debug their quantum processing algorithm, the answer had been sitting right there in the recursive memory allocation pattern. A pattern he'd been watching them miss night after night as he sat in this very chair waiting for his father to finish his rounds. 12 minutes, David." Marcus's tone carried the weight of a man who'd never once been late to anything that mattered. His father understood deadlines, even if he didn't understand why his 16-year-old son was scribbling equations at 11:48 p.m. in a building that wasn't theirs. David's fingers flew across the napkin, translating the solution from the chaos in his mind into something resembling readable code. The memory leak was hiding in plain sight. Every time the system processed large datasets, it created recursive loops that fragmented the available RAM until the whole thing collapsed like a house of cards. But if you replace the recursive call with an iterative loop and implemented a memory pool allocation system, the security system's countdown timer glowed red on the wall display. 001147, 001146. "I've got it." The words tumbled out of David's mouth as he stared at the napkin, his heart hammering against his ribs. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, so obvious that he couldn't believe TechCore's entire engineering department had missed it. But then again, they'd never spent their nights listening through thin conference room walls while their father mopped floors and emptied trash cans. Marcus paused in his cleaning, the industrial wheels of his cart squeaking to a halt. In the harsh fluorescent light, his father looked older than his 52 years, his shoulders bent from decades of night shifts and double overtime. The janitor's uniform hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight since taking on extra hours to help cover David's community college tuition. "Got what, son?" David held up the napkin, covered in equations and code fragments that probably looked like hieroglyphics to anyone who wasn't fluent in quantum processing algorithms. "The bug that's been killing their system. Dad, I know how to fix it." The countdown timer hit 10 minutes, and somewhere in the building, pre-security announcements would start echoing through the halls. Marcus had heard them 1,000 times before, but tonight something was different. Tonight, his son wasn't just sitting in that chair waiting. He was solving problems that had stumped some of the brightest minds in Silicon Valley. "You sure about that?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He'd stopped questioning his son's capabilities years ago, around the time David had taught himself calculus at age 12 and started correcting the math on his homework. David nodded, his eyes fixed on the wall of whiteboards where Dr. Patricia Reeves and her team had left their latest failed attempts. Lines of code stretched across the surfaces like abstract art, crossing and recrossing in patterns that spoke of desperation and diminishing returns. But David could see what they couldn't, the elegant simplicity hiding beneath layers of overcomplicated logic. The timer showed 00912 as David folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His father was right, they needed to leave. But as they walked toward the exit, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was carrying more than just a piece of paper. He was carrying the key to everything: TechCore's survival, his father's job security, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to prove that genius didn't require a Harvard degree or a corner office. The hallway lights dimmed automatically as they passed, motion sensors detecting their movement and illuminating their path toward the service elevator. Marcus pushed his cart with practiced efficiency, every movement economical and purposeful. This was his domain, these after-hours corridors where important decisions were made in empty rooms and million-dollar problems were left unsolved on whiteboards. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, David pressed his hand against his jacket pocket, feeling the crumpled edges of the napkin through the fabric. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to stay invisible in the shadows of his father's world or step into the light and risk everything they'd worked so hard to protect. The drive home through empty San Jose streets gave David time to think, but thinking was dangerous right now. Every red light brought memories: his mother's hospital bills that drained their savings, scholarship applications that never materialized, the community college acceptance letter that felt more like consolation than victory. Marcus kept the radio low, late-night jazz filling the silence. Their 1998 Honda Civic rattled over potholes, engine wheezing the same tired song it had sung for 3 years. David had taught himself automotive repair from YouTube videos, keeping their car alive with salvaged parts and determination, the same way he'd taught himself everything else that mattered. "You've been quiet tonight," Marcus said as they pulled into their duplex driveway. The porch light was burned out again, but replacing it meant choosing between a $15 bulb and groceries that would stretch until Friday. David didn't move to get out. Through the windshield, Mrs. Rodriguez's kitchen light glowed next door, probably nursing homework after another double shift. Their whole neighborhood was full of people like them, working 2 jobs, sacrificing sleep, chasing dreams that stayed just out of reach. "Dad, what if I could save TechCore? Really save them?" Marcus turned off the engine. He'd learned not to dismiss his son's ideas, not since 8-year-old David had fixed their water heater by teaching himself Spanish to translate the repair manual that stumped 3 contractors. "I'd say you've got my attention." David pulled out the napkin, damp with nervous sweat, smoothing it against the dashboard. Under the weak dome light, his handwriting looked less like genius and more like frantic scribbling from a kid in over his head. But the math was sound. He'd checked it 17 times during the drive. Their quantum processing algorithm has a memory leak. Large data sets create recursive loops that fragment RAM until the system crashes. Replace the recursive call with an iterative loop. Implement memory pool allocation. He traced equations with his finger, watching his father's eyes follow symbols that meant nothing to him. Marcus had worked at TechCore since David was 2, back when it operated from a converted warehouse and Sarah Chen was just another engineer with big dreams. He'd watched it grow from startup to corporate giant, cleaning the same offices while the people inside changed from sneaker-wearing 20-somethings to executives who barely noticed he existed. "How long have you been listening to their meetings?" 3 years, maybe 4. David folded the napkin like precious origami. "At first, it was just interesting, smart people discussing problems I understood. Then I started noticing patterns, solutions they were missing. Why didn't you ever say anything?" David's shrug carried the weight of every dismissal, every time he'd been told he was too young to understand. Who would listen? I'm the janitor's kid at community college. Dr. Reeves has 3 MIT degrees. The board's worth $500 million. What am I supposed to say? Excuse me, but you're doing it wrong? Marcus squeezed his son's shoulder, the same gesture he'd used when David cried about second-hand clothes at 7, or when he was 12 and frustrated because the library's internet was too slow for advanced math courses. "Your mother used to say God doesn't make mistakes. Every person gets exactly the gifts they need for the work they're meant to do." David had heard this before, but tonight felt different. With TechCore's future hanging in the balance and his solution burning in his pocket, his mother's words felt less like comfort and more like challenge. "The problem is, Dad, gifts don't matter if nobody's willing to unwrap them." When they finally went inside, David headed to his room, a converted garage Marcus had insulated and wired himself. Walls covered with printouts of academic papers and tutorials downloaded during precious library hours. His desk was a door on concrete blocks, holding 3 rebuilt monitors and a computer that could outrun most corporate workstations. Marcus paused in the doorway, watching his son settle into the chair where he spent most free time, teaching himself skills that should have been learned at Stanford or Caltech. Tomorrow meant another day of invisible work, 16 hours cleaning up after other people's success. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the balance was shifting. The elevator doors slid open with their familiar whisper, and David found himself face-to-face with Dr. Patricia Reeves for the first time in daylight. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes speaking to sleepless nights, wrestling with the same problem David carried folded in his pocket. Tuesday morning, 3 days since the napkin solution. TechCore stock had tumbled as headlines screamed, "Tech giant faces meltdown as AI system fails." David had memorized every article, every analyst's prediction of doom. "Excuse me," he said as Dr. Reeves reached for the button panel, fingers trembling from too much caffeine. "I know this sounds crazy, but I think I can help with your quantum processing problem." She looked at him then, really looked, and David watched recognition dawn. The janitor's kid. Invisible furniture in the landscape of corporate urgency. "I'm sorry, what's your name?" Her voice carried polite dismissal. She'd fielded dozens of well-meaning suggestions from security guards, assistants, and now apparently teenagers with delusions of grandeur. "David Williams. My father works here." He pulled out the napkin, edges worn from constant handling. "I know about the memory leak in your recursive algorithm. I think I know how to fix it." Dr. Reeves glanced at the napkin, then back at his face. David could see the exact moment when professional courtesy overrode any possibility of taking him seriously. A 16-year-old in secondhand clothes offering to solve what her MIT graduates couldn't crack. "That's thoughtful, David, but this is extremely complex software. We're dealing with quantum processing algorithms requiring years of specialized study." She pressed the executive floor button, gentle but firm dismissal. "I'm sure your father is proud of your interest in technology." The elevator rose in silence, each floor marking a missed opportunity. David watched numbers climb, 3, 4, 5, knowing when those doors opened, his chance would vanish. Dr. Reeves was already checking her phone, attention shifted to emails that actually mattered. "The recursive call creates infinite loops when memory gets fragmented," David said quietly, words tumbling out. "You're not clearing the stack properly, so each iteration builds until the system chokes. If you implement an iterative approach with memory pool allocation..." "David," Dr. Reeves looked up, patience that felt like condescension. "I have 3 MIT degrees and 15 years in quantum computing. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't something you learn from YouTube videos." The doors opened on 7. She stepped out without looking back. David stood alone, holding his solution, feeling smaller than elementary school when teachers assumed he was slow because he asked questions they couldn't answer. He found Marcus in the break room an hour later, eating his usual sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, an apple, coffee he'd stretched through his shift. "How'd it go?" Marcus asked, though David's expression told him everything. She didn't even look at it, said I couldn't possibly understand something that complex. David slumped into the plastic chair, napkin clutched in his fist. Through the window, they could see Dr. Reeves gesturing frantically at whiteboards while her team wore glazed expressions of people fighting the same losing battle. David had overheard junior engineers discussing resume updates in case the company folded.
You know what bothers me most? She didn't care enough to be curious. Like someone like me having something useful to say was so ridiculous it wasn't worth 30 seconds. Marcus wrapped up half his sandwich for later. 15 years of night shifts had taught him to ration everything: food, energy, hope. But watching his son's frustration, something shifted in his expression. Your mother used to clean houses before you were born. Once, she noticed their gardener using wrong fertilizer, killing prize roses. She tried telling the homeowner she'd grown up on her grandmother's farm, knew plants better than most professionals. But the woman smiled and said, "That's sweet, Elena, but we'll trust the expert we're paying." David looked up, sensing more to the story. 3 weeks later, all roses were dead. Cost thousands to replant. The expert had been lying about credentials for years. Marcus stood, brushing crumbs from his uniform. Your mother could have saved them money and heartache, but they were too proud to listen to someone they paid to clean toilets. That evening, as David waited for his father's shift to end, he made a decision. If Dr. Reeves wouldn't listen, maybe he could find someone who would. CEO Sarah Chen had built TechCore from nothing. She understood good ideas could come from anywhere. The question was whether success had insulated her from hearing voices in the shadows. Part 4. The Weight of Doubt. David spent Thursday night researching Sarah Chen until his eyes burned from staring at the rebuilt monitor screen. The CEO's biography read like a Silicon Valley fairy tale. Immigrant parents, Stanford scholarship, building TechCore from a garage startup to a billion-dollar empire. But fairy tales belong to people with happy endings, and David was starting to wonder if his story was heading somewhere darker. The doubt crept in during calculus class Friday morning, multiplying like the recursive loops he'd identified in TechCore's code. What if Dr. Reeves was right? What if a 16-year-old community college student really couldn't understand problems that stumped MIT graduates? Maybe his 3 years of eavesdropping had given him delusions of competence rather than actual insight. His professor droned about derivative functions, while David's phone buzzed with news alerts. TechCore stock had dropped another 12% overnight. The financial press was calling it a death spiral, and analysts were predicting massive layoffs if the AI system couldn't be salvaged. Each headline felt like a countdown timer ticking toward his father's unemployment. During lunch break, David called Marcus from the community college parking lot, sitting in their Honda while rain drummed against the windshield. "Dad, what if I'm wrong about the solution? What if I'm just some kid who thinks he's smarter than he actually is?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. David could hear the familiar sounds of TechCore in the background, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the low hum of a company trying to solve its way out of extinction. "You remember when you were 10 and Mrs. Patterson's computer kept crashing? She'd had 3 different repair shops look at it, spent almost $400. You fixed it in 20 minutes because you noticed something they all missed. That was different. That was just what? Just you seeing a pattern that experts overlooked." Marcus's voice carried the patience of a man who'd spent years watching his son doubt gifts that seemed obvious to everyone else. "David, I've been listening to those engineers for months. They're smart people, but smart doesn't always mean right. Sometimes it just means educated enough to overcomplicate simple problems." That afternoon, David found himself walking TechCore's halls during his father's shift, but for the first time, he felt like an intruder. The building buzzed with crisis energy, urgent meetings behind glass doors, people clutching coffee cups like lifelines, the kind of controlled panic that came with watching everything you'd built start to crumble.
Passed Dr. Reeves' office and saw her hunched over printouts, red pen in hand, marking up code like a teacher grading failed exams. Her team had been working 18-hour days, surviving on vending machine food and the kind of desperation that made smart people make stupid mistakes. In the elevator, David overheard 2 executives discussing contingency plans. "If we can't fix this by Monday, we'll have to start cutting departments. Facilities will be first to go."
The words hit him like ice water. Facilities meant his father. 15 years of perfect attendance, of arriving early and staying late, of treating other people's success as his own responsibility, all of it meaningless if David couldn't find the courage to speak up. But speaking up meant risking everything. If he was wrong, he'd be the janitor's kid who wasted the CEO's time during a crisis. If he was right but couldn't prove it fast enough, he'd still be blamed for the delay. Either way, his family would become the cautionary tale about people who didn't know their place. That evening, David sat in his converted garage bedroom, staring at the napkin that had started everything. The equations looked smaller now, less revolutionary, just scribbles that might represent genius or might represent the mathematical equivalent of wishful thinking. His phone lit up with another news alert. TechCore crisis deepens as weekend approaches. The article quoted anonymous sources saying the company had until Monday to find a solution or face potential bankruptcy proceedings. David folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Monday was 3 days away. 3 days to decide whether his mother's belief that everyone got exactly the gifts they needed was faith or fantasy. 3 days to choose between invisible safety and the terrifying possibility that sometimes the most important voices belong to people no one expected to hear. Outside his window, the neighborhood settled into its familiar Friday night rhythm. Working families grateful for the weekend, parents calculating grocery budgets, kids dreaming about futures that seemed both infinite and impossibly far away. David knew that by Monday, his family's place in this world might change forever, one way or another. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling. The newspaper's business section lay between David and Marcus like evidence in a trial. TechCore's crisis splashed across headlines that might as well have been writing his father's pink slip. Emergency board meeting Monday, Marcus read aloud. CEO Sarah Chen has 48 hours to present a solution or face investor revolt. David pushed eggs around his plate, appetite gone. "I'm going with you today." Marcus looked up. "Son, it's Saturday, just basic maintenance." "They're going to fire you Monday if someone doesn't fix this." David stood, chair scraping against worn linoleum. "We both know it." The weekend at TechCore felt smaller, less imposing without its usual energy. Marcus used his keycard at the service entrance, leading them into fluorescent silence. "Skeleton crew working," Marcus explained past empty cubicles. "Dr. Reeves and 3 engineers on 7. Building's basically ours." They worked quietly for 2 hours, checking filters, carrying supplies. But approaching the executive level, David heard tired voices through conference room doors, cycling through familiar arguments. "We've tried everything," Dr. Reeves was saying. "Memory optimization, restructuring, hardware upgrades. The recursive function keeps creating bottlenecks." "We need outside consultants," another voice replied. "IBM, Google, fresh perspective." "We don't have time for fresh perspective," Sarah Chen's voice cut through, sharp with exhaustion. "We need a miracle with 48-hour delivery." David stopped walking. Marcus continued down the hall, but David remained frozen, listening to the same technical discussion he'd heard for months. They were trapped in loops, not just the code, but their thinking. Brilliant minds unable to see past degrees to the simple solutions staring them in the face. The napkin felt heavy in his pocket. His mother's words echoed. Every person gets exactly the gifts they need for the work they're meant to do. Maybe his work wasn't getting into MIT. Maybe it was standing here Saturday morning, holding a solution nobody expected from someone nobody noticed. David pulled out his phone, opened notes, and typed quickly. "To whoever finds this, the quantum processing algorithm fails because recursive memory allocation creates stack overflow under heavy load. Replace recursive calls with iterative loops. Implement memory pool allocation. The bottleneck isn't hardware, it's logical architecture. Someone who believes solutions can come from anywhere." The executives' voices moved to another floor. David slipped into the empty conference room, placed his phone on the table with the note displayed, and weighted it with an abandoned coffee mug.
The executives' voices moved to another floor. David slipped into the empty conference room, placed his phone on the table with the note displayed, and weighted it with an abandoned coffee mug. Then he took the napkin from his pocket, smoothed it carefully, and placed it beside the phone. 3 weeks of doubt and fear. But sitting on the polished table, his solution looked exactly like what it was, the right answer, regardless of who had written it. David found Marcus on the 3rd floor. His father took one look at his face and knew something had shifted. "You did it. You found a way to make them listen." David nodded, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "I left it where they can't ignore it. What happens next isn't up to me anymore." Leaving the building that evening, David realized he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. By Monday morning, either his solution would save TechCore or his family would be looking for new ways to survive. Either way, he'd finally stopped being invisible. David's phone rang at 6:47 a.m. Monday morning, jarring him awake from restless dreams. Marcus was already gone, early shift to be there when the executives arrived. The caller ID showed TechCore's main number. "David Williams?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Jennifer Walsh, Executive Assistant to CEO Sarah Chen. She'd like to meet with you this morning. Can you be here by 8? David sat up, heart hammering. "Yes, ma'am, I'll be there." He threw on his best clothes, khakis and a button-down that Marcus had bought for his community college interviews, and caught 2 buses to reach TechCore by 7:55. The lobby buzzed with unusual energy for a Monday morning. Executives clustering in urgent conversation, phones ringing constantly. Jennifer Walsh met him at the elevator bank, a woman in her 40s with the efficient manner of someone who scheduled other people's lives down to the minute. "The CEO is in emergency session with the board. Your solution worked, David. They implemented it yesterday, and the system's been running flawlessly for 18 hours. The elevator ride to the top floor felt surreal. David had spent 3 years in this building's shadows, and now he was ascending to levels he'd only seen from the outside through glass windows. Sarah Chen's office overlooked Silicon Valley like a command center. She stood with her back to the door, phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly in what sounded like Mandarin. When she turned around, David was struck by how young she looked, maybe 40, with tired eyes that had probably seen too many 18-hour days. "David," she gestured to a chair across from her desk, "I understand you're the anonymous genius who saved my company." "I just noticed a pattern," David said, settling into leather that probably cost more than his family's monthly rent. The recursive loops were fragmenting memory allocation. It was obvious once you saw it. Sarah smiled, but something complicated flickered in her expression. "Obvious to you, not so obvious to my team of PhD engineers who've been working on this for months." She opened a folder on her desk. "I've been reading about you. 16 years old, community college student, son of our facilities manager, self-taught programming." David nodded, unsure where this was heading. "Here's my problem," Sarah continued. "The board is ecstatic that the crisis is resolved, but they're also asking uncomfortable questions. How did a teenager solve what our expensive engineering team couldn't? What does that say about our hiring practices, our corporate structure, our entire approach to innovation?" Through the office windows, David could see into the conference room, where Dr. Reeves sat with 3 board members, her face pale and drawn. The woman who dismissed him in the elevator now looked like someone facing professional execution. "Some people think we should keep this quiet," Sarah said. "Credit the engineering team, let Dr. Reeves save face, avoid the media circus that would come from admitting a 16-year-old outsmarted R&D department." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And what do you think?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face like she was trying to read something written there. "I think we're at a crossroads. We can either admit that good ideas come from unexpected places, or we can keep pretending that expensive degrees guarantee wisdom." A knock interrupted them. Jennifer Walsh stepped in, looking nervous. "Ms. Chen, the board is requesting your presence. They're discussing the situation." Sarah stood up. "David, I need you to wait here. The board wants to meet you, but I need to prepare them first. Some of them are having difficulty accepting that our salvation came from—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. From the janitor's kid, David finished. From someone they never thought to listen to, Sarah corrected gently. There's a difference. Left alone in the office, David could see the board meeting through the glass walls. Animated discussion, pointing at documents, Dr. Reeves speaking rapidly while board members frowned. He couldn't hear the words, but body language told the story. Resistance, discomfort, the kind of institutional pushback that happened when established order got disrupted. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Heard rumors they're calling you upstairs. You okay? David typed back. They fixed the system with my solution, but I think some people wish they hadn't. Through the glass, he watched Sarah Chen stand up at the head of the conference table, her voice carrying enough force that he could almost hear it through the walls. Whatever she was saying, some board members were nodding, while others looked skeptical. By Tuesday morning, David's anonymity was dead. Someone had leaked the story to TechCrunch with the headline, "Teen Genius Saves Silicon Valley Giant While Janitor Dad Cleans Offices." His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since 5 a.m. Reporters, bloggers, producers from morning shows all wanting to interview the kid who outsmarted MIT. David sat in his community college parking lot, staring at the article that had gone viral overnight. The comments section was a battlefield. Half the readers called him inspiring. The other half questioned whether a black teenager could really solve problems that stumped professional engineers. Probably just lucky, read one comment. Someone else did the work and he's taking credit, read another. His phone rang. Sarah Chen's number. David, I'm sorry. We're investigating the leak, but the damage is done. The media is camping outside our building, and my board is in full crisis mode. Her voice carried exhaustion and something that might have been regret. I need you to come in for a press conference this afternoon. The world wants to hear from you. What if I don't want to talk to the world? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then we'll respect that. But David, right now, there are thousands of kids who look like you watching this story. They're seeing someone who proves that genius doesn't require privilege. That matters more than corporate comfort. The press conference was scheduled for 3 p.m. in TechCore's main lobby. By 2:30, the space was packed with cameras, reporters, and employees who'd gathered to witness something unprecedented. David had never seen so many people focused on him at once. It felt like standing naked under stage lights. Sarah Chen took the podium first, her statement carefully crafted. TechCore has always believed innovation comes from diverse perspectives. David Williams exemplifies that belief. His solution saved not just our company, but potentially thousands of jobs. When David stepped forward, the crowd went silent, except for camera shutters clicking like mechanical rain. He looked out at faces ranging from curious to skeptical to genuinely supportive, and realized this moment would define how the world saw him, and how he saw himself. 3 weeks ago, I was invisible, he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. I sat in corners while my father worked, listening to brilliant people discuss problems I thought I understood. But nobody asked what I thought because nobody saw me as someone worth asking.
David, some people question whether you really solved this alone. Can you walk us through your process? The question hit like a slap, but David had prepared for this. He moved to the whiteboard that had been set up, marker in hand, and began writing equations from memory. The recursive algorithm, the memory allocation problem, the iterative solution, all of it flowing from his mind to the board in real time. The issue was stack overflow caused by recursive calls not properly clearing memory buffers, he explained, his confidence growing as he worked. When you process large data sets, each recursive call builds on previous allocations until the system runs out of available RAM. The solution is replacing recursive architecture with iterative loops and implementing memory pool allocation to prevent fragmentation. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the most skeptical faces were paying attention now, watching a teenager explain complex algorithms with the fluency of someone who truly understood them. But here's what I really learned, David continued, setting down the marker. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being willing to see patterns that others might miss because they're looking too hard in one direction. Innovation doesn't care about your background, your age, or whether you have fancy degrees. It cares about whether you're paying attention. Another reporter raised her hand. What's next for you? MIT? Stanford? David glanced toward the back of the room where his father stood in his work uniform, having come straight from his shift. Marcus gave him a small nod, the same gesture he'd used when David was 7 and afraid to ride his bike without training wheels. I don't know yet, David said honestly, but I know I want to keep solving problems that matter, and I want other kids who feel invisible to know that their ideas are worth hearing, even if nobody's listening yet. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, some supportive, others probing for weaknesses or inconsistencies in his story. Through it all, David felt something shift inside him. The boy who'd hidden in shadows was disappearing, replaced by someone willing to stand in the light and defend not just his own intelligence, but the principle that good ideas could emerge from anywhere. As the press conference ended, David realized the hardest part wasn't proving he could solve technical problems. It was proving to a world that had spent 16 years not seeing him that he'd been worth noticing all along. The call came 3 days later while David was trying to catch up on calculus homework he'd missed during the media storm. Sarah Chen's voice carried an energy he'd never heard before, excitement mixed with something that sounded like determination. David, can you and your father come in this afternoon? I have something to show you. The TechCore lobby buzzed with different energy now. Employees who'd never acknowledged David before nodded respectfully as he passed. The security guard who'd watched him sit in corners for 3 years actually smiled and said, "Good morning, Mr. Williams." Sarah met them at the elevator, but instead of heading to her office, she pressed the button for the auditorium. The board met yesterday for 8 hours, she said as they rode up. It was intense. The auditorium was packed with TechCore employees, local media, and faces David didn't recognize. As they entered, spontaneous applause broke out, growing until the entire room was on their feet. David felt his cheeks burn, but Marcus squeezed his shoulder, pride radiating from his father like warmth from a furnace.
Sarah took the podium, waiting for silence. 3 weeks ago, this company almost failed because we forgot a fundamental truth. Innovation doesn't require permission, and genius doesn't need credentials. Today, we're announcing changes that will ensure we never make that mistake again. She gestured to a large screen behind her. The TechCore Innovation Initiative, a full scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in STEM fields. Our first recipient will receive a complete ride to MIT, plus mentorship and internship opportunities. David's heart stopped. MIT, the dream he'd abandoned as financially impossible, was suddenly impossibly real. But that's not all, Sarah continued. We're also announcing the promotion of Marcus Williams to head of facilities management with a compensation package that includes equity shares in the company. The applause was deafening. David turned to see his father's face, shock, disbelief, and something that might have been tears threatening to spill over. 15 years of invisible work, suddenly visible, valued, rewarded. Dr. Reeves has asked to say something, Sarah added, stepping aside. Patricia Reeves approached the microphone, looking humbled in a way David had never seen. I want to publicly apologize to David Williams. My prejudice almost cost us everything. I dismissed him, not because his ideas were wrong, but because I couldn't imagine someone like him being right. She turned to face David directly. You taught me that experience can blind us as much as illuminate us. Thank you for persisting when I failed to listen. The crowd was silent now, witnessing something rare in corporate America, genuine accountability and growth. Sarah reclaimed the microphone. But David had one condition for accepting our offer. He wanted to address you himself.
David's legs felt weak as he approached the podium, but his voice was strong when he spoke. 6 months ago, I thought my biggest problem was affording community college textbooks. Today, you're offering me, MIT, and my father the recognition he's deserved for 15 years. He looked out at the crowd. Engineers, executives, janitors, security guards, all the invisible people who kept TechCore running. But here's what I really want everyone to know. This shouldn't be extraordinary. Every kid deserves a chance to show what they can do. Every parent deserves respect for honest work. Every voice deserves to be heard, regardless of where it comes from. The applause started slowly, then built like thunder. But David wasn't finished. The scholarship program is incredible, but it's just the beginning. TechCore is committing to visiting underserved schools, partnering with community colleges, and creating pathways for talent that traditional recruiting misses. We're going to prove that when you expand who gets to contribute, everyone benefits. As David stepped away from the microphone, he caught sight of Dr. Reeves applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Marcus was crying openly now, no longer caring who saw. And Sarah Chen looked like someone who just remembered why she started TechCore in the first place. The boy who'd been invisible for 16 years was finally fully seen. But more importantly, he'd used that visibility to light the way for others still waiting in the shadows, still believing their ideas might matter if someone would just listen. The ceiling hadn't just been broken, it had been obliterated, and David Williams was standing in the sunlight streaming through.
5 years later, David stood in MIT's lecture hall, looking out at 200 eager faces as he prepared to deliver his senior thesis presentation. The scared 16-year-old who'd scribbled equations on a napkin felt like a character from someone else's story. Distributed computing architectures in underserved communities, he announced, clicking to his first slide. How we can democratize access to advanced technology by building networks that work for everyone, not just those who can afford Silicon Valley solutions. In the back row, Marcus sat in his best suit, the one he'd bought after TechCore went public and his equity shares made national news. These days, he split time between managing TechCore's facilities and traveling the country as a speaker for the company's Pathways to Innovation program. The presentation went flawlessly, but David was already thinking beyond graduation. MIT had been transformative, but it was just preparation for the real work. He'd spent summers in communities like the one he'd grown up in, working with kids who reminded him of himself. Brilliant minds trapped by circumstances, waiting for someone to notice their potential. After the presentation, David's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. Watch the live stream. Board approved your proposal. $50 million to launch the Community Innovation Labs. Congratulations, Director Williams. The title still felt surreal. At 21, David would be overseeing TechCore's most ambitious social initiative, technology centers in underserved neighborhoods, equipped with high-speed internet, advanced computing resources, and mentorship programs connecting local kids with industry professionals. That evening, David drove back to his old neighborhood in San Jose. The duplex where he'd grown up now housed a young family from El Salvador, their daughter's bicycle in the same spot where David used to park his study materials. Mrs. Rodriguez still lived next door, now a registered nurse thanks to the community college scholarship fund that had been inspired by David's story. He found Marcus at TechCore, even though it was well past business hours. His father was training the night security team on the new access protocols he designed, innovations that treated every employee as valuable, regardless of their role or education level. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Marcus said as they walked through the building that had changed their lives. "Your mother would have been proud, but not surprised. She always knew you were special." They paused outside the conference room where David had first left his solution 5 years ago. The space had been converted into the Elena Williams Memorial Innovation Lab, where employees were encouraged to pursue passion projects and submit ideas regardless of their department or position.
37 patents have come out of this room, Marcus said, reading the plaque by the door. From janitors, administrative assistants, security guards, cafeteria workers. People who had ideas but never had anyone ask them what they were thinking. David smiled, remembering the napkin that started everything. It was framed now in Sarah Chen's office, a reminder that breakthrough solutions could come from anywhere. Mom always said everyone gets exactly the gifts they need for the work they're meant to do. "And what's your work now?" Marcus asked. David pulled out his phone, showing his father the application that had been approved that morning. Community innovation labs in 12 cities, starting with neighborhoods that looked exactly like the one they'd grown up in. Kids who were brilliant but invisible. Parents who worked multiple jobs to keep dreams alive. Communities that had been written off by people who'd never bothered to look closely. "I'm going to make sure no one else has to wait 16 years to be seen," David said. As they left the building, David noticed something that still amazed him: the way employees at every level nodded respectfully to his father. Marcus Williams wasn't just the head of facilities anymore. He was the man who'd raised the kid who saved the company, the one who proved that great ideas could emerge from anywhere if you created space for them to grow. The TechCore parking lot was mostly empty, but lights still burned in several windows. Engineers, designers, and dreamers working late on projects that might change the world. Somewhere in those offices, David knew, the next breakthrough was waiting to be discovered by someone others might overlook. The boy who'd once been invisible had learned to see in the dark, and now he was teaching others to do the same. Some stories end with personal success, but the best ones end with open doors that can never be closed again. David Williams had become living proof that when you change who gets to participate, you change what becomes possible. And that change was just beginning.